Have you ever looked at a truly breathtaking piece of art, something monumental, and just felt like you were missing a massive, glaring piece of the puzzle?
Oh, absolutely. It happens all the time with the classics.
Right. So think about Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling. We all know that iconic image,
Of
right?
course, the creation of Adam.
Exactly. God is depicted as this older, muscular man with a flowing white beard, floating in the heavens, reaching out his finger to touch the hand of Adam. I mean, it is one of the most famous, reproduced images in human history.
It's everywhere.
But here is a question for now. If God is a man reaching out to Adam, who is the woman he has his other arm casually wrapped around like a lover?
Yeah, that is such a profound question, and honestly, one that most people never even think to ask when they look up at that ceiling,
I never did.
right? We
Yeah.
just stare at that masterpiece. We
Uh,
see this intense dynamic between the creator and the first man, and we completely, totally gloss over the feminine presence situated right there in the divine embrace.
Yeah.
She is literally tucked under the left arm of the Almighty, and yet, historically, she's almost treated as like background scenery.
I mean, as a kid, it's natural to just look at that and assume, oh, that must be God's wife.
Sure, is a logical leap.
But then you grow up, and the dominant theological structures of society tell you that, well, God is a singular, strictly masculine entity, or at best, a formless entity that we just default to calling he.
Right, exactly.
And suddenly, that woman in the painting becomes this huge, confusing mystery. Like, why would Michelangelo put her there?
He changes the whole context.
It really does.
Yeah.
That specific question, that sense of missing halves of a forgotten biological and spiritual balance in how we view the universe, that is our gateway into the source material for today's deep dive.
And our source material today is just a fascinating, really complex text. We're looking at excerpts from A Wiccan Bible by A.J. Drew.
No, wait, I know what that title evokes for a lot of people.
Oh, definitely.
It brings to mind, pointy hats, bubbling cauldrons, or teenagers playing with a Ouija board at a sleepover.
Hollywood has done a lot of heavy lifting there.
Yeah, totally. But we need to clarify right now that this deep dive is not about casting spooky spells from a movie. What we are actually looking at today is a highly sophisticated framework that attempts to merge visceral ancient mythology with the hard laws of modern science.
Which is such a rare combination. The architecture of this belief system is built on the premise that science and faith are not enemies at all.
Right.
They're essentially two different dialects of the exact same language.
Yeah.
And what is so compelling about Drew's approach is that he doesn't shy away from the ugly parts of that physical reality.
No, he really leans into them.
He does. He demands a radical, almost terrifying level of personal accountability.
Yeah.
And it's important to note right away that Drew uses his own profound frustrations, both personal tragedies and his political despair over the 2003 Iraq War, as the literal anvil on which he hammers out this theology.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because you'd think a book tackling the origins of the universe and, the laws of thermodynamics would start with some grand, sweeping declaration from a mountaintop.
You really would.
But it doesn't at all. It starts somewhere incredibly small, mundane, and honestly heartbreakingly personal.
It starts with grief. Raw grief.
Yeah?
The author frames this entire theological exploration by recounting the loss of his pets. He had an iguana named Fred and a ferret named Thumper.
The story is just so raw. He fed his iguana some grapes he bought at the grocery store.
It was a normal, everyday thing.
Right. But he was completely unaware that grapes, especially imported ones, in this case from Chile, can sometimes carry compounds or residues that are wildly toxic to certain animals.
It's tragic.
So the iguana goes into sudden, acute renal failure. Then, not realizing what caused it, he feeds a grape to the ferret, and the ferret gets violently sick too.
And he spends days in absolute agony trying everything to save them. He's administering subcutaneous fluids, using needles and IVs, desperately trying to flush the toxins out of their little bodies.
Wow.
But they both die. And what he is left with is a crushing, suffocating guilt. He writes about feeling like a monster because in his desperate attempt to keep them alive, he feels he only extended their suffering.
Let's just pause in that emotional state for a second.
Yeah.
Imagine carrying that micro-level guilt. You killed the things you loved because you bought fruit at a grocery store.
It's devastating.
And he is experiencing this intense, localized tragedy against the macro-level backdrop of the outbreak of the Iraq War. It's 2003. He is sitting at home watching this 24/7 news cycle show bombs dropping over Baghdad, feeling like the entire world is just fracturing.
Yeah, and he had actually assured his mother prior to this that the country wouldn't devolve into bitter partisanship.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he thought people would rise above politics to support the soldiers, regardless of the conflict's origins. And as he watches the societal fabric tear, he realizes he was wrong about that too. He feels surrounded by suffering, by mistakes, by massive systemic failures of empathy.
So his pets are gone. His nightly routine of watching the news with his mother is ruined by the grim reality of war coverage.
Everything is falling apart for him.
And the only solace he finds, like the literal only thing holding his daily rhythm together and keeping him tethered to humanity, is his morning routine of buying a bottle of Mountain Dew from a cheerful young clerk at a gas station.
That brief, pleasant human interaction becomes his lifeline.
Yeah, it's wild.
What's fascinating here is how intentional this contrast is. He is using this highly relatable raw grief to ground his entire spiritual framework. By starting with a dying ferret and a war on television, he is signaling to the reader that this religion is not about escaping reality.
It's not a coping mechanism to avoid the bad stuff.
Exactly. It isn't some astral plane you retreat to when the real world gets too heavy. It is about hyper-engaging with reality. If you're going to practice this faith, you have to do it in a world where iguanas die from tainted grapes and nations bomb each other over resources.
And it's directly from this place of worldly, cynical engagement that he completely redefines what it means to be a professional witch.
Right. He tosses out all the stereotypes.
He completely discards the idea of spells or magic tricks. He defines a witch as someone who is fundamentally averse to the destructive status quo of the modern world.
And to understand that, we have to look at how he addresses the concept of Satan.
Oh yes, let's get into this.
Because in popular culture, witchcraft and Satanism are constantly conflated. But Drew traces the word Satan back to its original linguistic root. In ancient Hebrew, Ha-Satan wasn't a red guy with a pitchfork in hell.
No, as a title, right.
Exactly. It meant the accuser or the adversary. It was akin to a prosecuting attorney in the heavenly court.
So if a witch is an adversary in this modern context, what exactly are they prosecuting?
The author argues they are averse to being told what to think without questioning the mechanics of why. They are the adversary to the standard operating procedures that lead to endless global conflict, the pollution of the oceans, and a mass extinction rate of plants and animals that currently rivals the extinction of the dinosaurs.
Which is horrifying.
It is. He views the destruction of the environment not just as bad civic policy, but as a literal desecration of the divine. Because in this framework, the earth is the divine.
So Wiccans are the people sounding the alarm on a dying world. They're the ones refusing to look away from the car crash.
Precisely. And he is highly critical of people who treat witchcraft as a trendy fashion statement.
Right, the aesthetic crowd.
Yeah, when uninitiated people flock to the religion because they want to feel mysterious or because they saw a cool vibe on social media, they are completely missing the grueling spiritual burden of the path.
He uses this visceral mythological image to describe that burden, too. He says the uninitiated miss the horror and dread.
The Grias sisters.
Yeah, in Greek myth, these concepts are personified by the Grays sisters, Pimferdo, and then Enyo, which translates to horror, and Dino, which translates to dread. He's basically saying that waking up to the reality of the world isn't supposed to be fun.
It requires looking directly at the horror of environmental collapse, the dread of human suffering, the reality of political greed, and choosing to care anyway. It is an active, painful engagement.
But let me push back on this framing for a second, because listening to this setup, I have to ask, is this just modern environmentalism and political frustration dressed up in ancient robes?
That's a very fair question to ask.
I mean, I can't help but compare it to the movie The Matrix. Is the author essentially saying that taking the red pill of Wicca just means waking up to the painful, ugly realities of capitalism and climate change that everyone else is ignoring to stay comfortable?
The Matrix analogy is actually spot on for what he's describing. Taking the red pill is exactly the mechanism here.
Right.
But to answer your question, he isn't just dressing up politics in robes. For him, the distinction between ecology and theology simply doesn't exist.
Oh, interesting. So they're literally the same thing.
Right. Environmentalism is just the secular term for what he views as a deeply spiritual imperative. The horror and dread aren't just political realities you vote on. They are spiritual trials you must endure to mature as a soul.
Wow.
To be a witch is to refuse the comforting illusion of the blue pill, to face the horror, and then to take ultimate responsibility for your role in it.
And taking that kind of responsibility requires a massive shift in how you view your own physical body and its place in the universe. Which brings us to the physical practices of the religion. Let's move from the macro grief of the world down to the microenvironment of a bathtub.
The lustral bath. This is where the physical practice really begins.
I have to admit, when I first read this section, I was pretty skeptical.
I think most people would be.
Yeah, because we usually think of a bath as a way to wash off the dirt after a long day, or maybe a way to relax with some bubbles. But in this text, the lustral bath taken before any ritual is framed not as hygiene, but as a literal physical reenactment of the biological evolution of life on Earth.
Which goes right back to Drew's explicit assertion that Wicca is, first and foremost, a cult of science.
Right.
And we should clarify the word cult here. He is using it in its original Latin sense, cultus, meaning care, cultivation, or a system of religious veneration.
Ah, okay.
He's saying this religion is a veneration of the truth as discovered by the scientific method. And what does science tell us about the origins of life? It began in the primordial oceans.
So break down the mechanics of this bath for me, because the symbolism he layers over the actual chemistry is incredibly dense.
It is. It starts with the water. The author instructs that you draw the bath water scalding hot.
Which doesn't sound very relaxing.
No, it's not for comfort. It represents the Hadean eon, the primordial, lifeless, volatile, boiling earth. You wait for it to cool down to a tolerable temperature, which mirrors the geological cooling of the planet over millions of years.
Okay, I track that.
Then you take sea salt, and it must specifically be sea salt, and you let it run from your hand into the water.
Wait, slow down. How does the salt fit into the primordial soup metaphor?
Well, the water represents the feminine principle, the great womb of Mother Earth. The sea salt represents the masculine principle. In the chemistry of abiogenesis, which is the natural process by which life arises from non-living matter, you need a catalyst.
Oh, I see.
Adding the salt symbolizes the introduction of the building blocks of life. It is the symbolic equivalent of a massive lightning strike hitting the primordial ocean, fusing amino acids together. Or, on a mammalian level, sperm entering a womb.
Wow.
It is the exact sparking moment when dormant potential transforms into life.
So you were basically creating a microcosm of the ancient Earth in your porcelain tub. Then you enter the bath. You are soaking in the primordial soup. And what fascinated me is the exit protocol. When you are done, you don't just jump out and grab a towel. You stand up and you watch the water go down the drain. You visualize it taking your modern worldly anxieties, your bills, your emails, your political dread down with it.
Right.
And then, as you physically step over the edge of the tub, that action represents the very first single-celled organism and eventually humanity leaving the ocean and walking onto dry land.
Every single bath becomes a journey spanning billions of years.
So what does this all mean? I mean, I love the psychology of this. It is wildly different from a quick shower before work. It feels like a deliberate daily software reboot for the human operating system.
That's a perfect way to describe it.
You are clearing the chaotic RAM of your daily life and reinstalling the foundational code, reminding yourself that you aren't just an isolated ego stressed about a deadline. You are a biological organism. You are the latest breathing link in a massive ancient evolutionary chain.
Software reboot perfectly captures the intent. What this bath does is conceptually bridge the gap between Darwinian evolution and spiritual rebirth.
Yeah.
In the dominant theological narratives of the past few centuries, creation and evolution are treated as mortal enemies. You either believe a deity snapped their fingers and materialized man from dust, or you believe in the slow, blind crawl of natural selection.
Might be laws in either or.
But this text looks at that divide and says, why not both? The agonizingly slow, complex, beautiful process of evolution is the divine creation. The bath forces you to internalize that scientific reality through physical action.
And he doesn't just stop at salt, either. He provides very specific botanical recipes to add to this bath depending on your intent, and they are rooted in the physical properties of the plants. If you are preparing for an initiation, he recommends rosemary and sandalwood.
Right?
If you're focusing on love, you use lovage, rose, and orris root. For protection against negative influences, pine needles, and bay leaf.
And the choice of herbs isn't random mysticism. Take sandalwood and rosemary. Rosemary has been scientifically shown to stimulate the olfactory bulb in a way that enhances memory retention and alertness.
Seriously?
Yes, and sandalwood contains compounds that interact with brain receptors to reduce anxiety without causing drowsiness. You are literally manipulating your neurochemistry through scent to prepare your mind for the ritual.
And he includes very practical, hard science warnings alongside these spiritual recipes. For instance, he explicitly warns readers that adding cinnamon oil to hot bath water can literally cause severe contact dermatitis.
It's extremely dangerous.
Yeah, it will burn your skin and mucous membranes. It's a stark reminder that nature isn't just a gentle, fluffy metaphor. It is physical chemistry. It is volatile, and you have to respect its laws.
Which leads directly into his thoughts on what to wear during these personal rites, specifically the concept of being skyclad.
Right, being completely naked. He suggests that for a personal self-dedication ritual, you should be bare.
It's about stripping away the artifice of human society. Clothing is the primary way we signal hierarchy, you know? It tells people your class, your job, your wealth, your fashion sense.
Exactly.
When you take off the suit or the uniform, you are discarding the social construct. You are standing before the universe exactly as you evolved. He notes that if a practitioner cannot be comfortable naked alone in a room, they likely have significant psychological blocks regarding shame and their own biological nature that they need to work through before they can truly engage with the natural world.
You have to shed the societal self to find the evolutionary self. Okay, so you've had the bath, you've rebooted your operating system, you've remembered your evolutionary roots. Now, we move from the private, solitary experience to the community space. Let's look at the architecture of the group ritual. The text walks us through the structure of creating a sacred space, and it starts with a simple household tool, a broom.
Abysm in the traditional terminology.
Right. The host or hostess stands in the center of the gathering area and begins to sweep outward in a counterclockwise direction. But the author makes a very specific point to clarify that the broom doesn't even need to touch the physical ground. You aren't sweeping up dust bunnies.
No, you are sweeping intent. You are clearing the psychological atmosphere.
Okay, explain that.
Well, when guests arrive at a gathering, they bring the chaos of the outside world with them. Road rage, an argument with a spouse, work stress. The counterclockwise motion is traditionally associated with banishing or unwinding. The host is visually and psychologically signaling to everyone in the room, we are unwinding the tension of the day. Leave it outside.
This is followed by asperging, which involves blessing the space by sprinkling water, and smudging, which is passing incense or smoke through the area. But the most fascinating part of this preparation phase to me is a psychological exercise he calls dealing with the outsiders.
This is just a brilliant piece of practical psychology disguised as mysticism.
Seriously, when you hear outsiders, it sounds like you are banishing literal demons or ghosts from the room. But the text defines the outsiders as the baneful, toxic things within ourselves that we wish we could get rid of. Greed, racism, bigotry, jealousy, bad habits.
Yeah.
In this part of the ritual, everyone acknowledges that they brought these negative traits with them into the room. You actively name your bad habits, offer them up, and symbolically banish them from the circle.
If we look at this through a Carl Jung lens, this is classic shadow work.
Yep.
You cannot create a pure, functional community space if everyone is pretending to be perfect.
Because it's faked.
Exactly. If you suppress your greed or your prejudice, it will eventually leak out and corrupt the group dynamic. By explicitly naming the outsiders, by admitting, I brought my anger with me today, you rob it of its subconscious power. You are forcing a confrontation with your own flaws before the real work begins.
And only once the space is cleared of these psychological outsiders is the circle actually cast. And this is a deeply spatial, geometric act. The participants draw the energy of Mother Earth up and the energy of Father Sky down, walking clockwise to form a boundary.
It represents the horizon line where Earth meets sky.
Yeah, it creates a definitive boundary between the sacred intent of the group and the mundane chaos of the world outside.
And once the perimeter is established, they construct the internal architecture by inviting the four quarters. They face east to invoke air, represented by the White King. They face south to invoke fire and the Blue King, west for water and the Red King, north for earth and the Green King.
It is world building in real time. They are acknowledging that the work they are about to do requires the entirety of the natural world's elements to function. And within this fully constructed, balanced universe, they perform what is known as the symbolic Great Rite.
Which is a profound acknowledgement of biological reality.
Yeah, the Great Rite is where the athame, a ritual knife representing the masculine principle, is slowly lowered into a chalice filled with wine or water, which represents the feminine principle. The text does not mince words about this. It is symbolic sexual intercourse.
Right.
It is a visual, communal reminder that the creation of new life, the continuation of the species, requires the union of male and female biology. It honors the messy, physical reality of procreation as a fundamentally divine act.
Which sets the stage for the climax of the group ritual, raising the cone of power.
The cone of power. I mean, when you just say the phrase out loud, it sounds like a spell from a fantasy role-playing game.
It really does.
But Drew grounds the mechanics of this firmly in human psychology and group dynamics. It is essentially group creative visualization driven by physical exhaustion.
Let's look at the spatial arrangement. You have multiple concentric circles. In the very center, you have the musicians, typically drummers. Around them, you have a circle of people dancing. And forming the outer boundary, you have a circle of people chanting.
They are working together to raise energy. The drumming starts slow, and then the beats per minute steadily increase. The dancing gets more frantic, matching the rhythm. The chanting gets louder and more intense.
Building that pressure.
Right. Everyone in the room is focusing on a single, stated intent. Maybe the goal of the ritual is a desire for peace in a war-torn area, or healing for a sick community member. The energy builds and builds until it reaches a physical breaking point.
And the release mechanism is purely biological.
How so?
The text states that the signal to release this built-up energy, to mentally send that intent out into the universe, happens when someone literally drops to the ground from physical exhaustion.
Just collapses.
Yes. When that dancer finally collapses, the drummers stop instantly. The silence is deafening. Everyone drops to the ground. And in that moment of sudden stillness, the collective intent is fired off.
I have to pause here because I love how the author handles the chanting aspect of this. He playfully skewers a common trope in occult communities. He points out that chanting in a dead language you don't understand is totally practically useless.
Oh, yeah.
He uses a Latin phrase as a joke, ego similis nutrio asinius vomer.
Which, if you translate it roughly, means absolutely nothing. It's gibberish about a donkey and a plow.
Right. If you are chanting that just because it sounds spooky and ancient, you aren't focusing your mind on peace or healing. You're just making noise. I think the best way to understand the cone of power is to compare it to a laser beam.
Okay, tell me more.
Well, a standard light bulb scatters photons in every direction. It creates a gentle glow that warms a room, but it doesn't really have any focused impact. But a laser works by aligning all the light waves so they oscillate perfectly in phase, marching in the exact same direction. When you do that, the light becomes coherent and it can cut through solid steel.
That is an excellent analogy.
The cone of power is trying to create a psychological laser. If everyone is chanting in a language they don't understand or thinking about their grocery list, the photons are scattering. The energy is useless. The cone only works if everyone's psychological waves are perfectly synced up by clear, understandable communication. If we connect this to the bigger picture and look closely at the neurobiology of what is happening here, it is a sophisticated mechanism for altering brain chemistry. Whether it is ecstatic public dancing and drumming, intense chanting, or even the private practices of sex magic, the underlying biological goal is identical.
Hacking the brain.
Exactly. You are purposefully inducing a trance state. The heavy exertion, the hyperventilation from chanting, the acoustic driving of the repetitive drumming. These actions flood the nervous system with endorphins, adrenaline, and dopamine.
You are basically pushing the body until the conscious critical mind just gives up.
Yes. And when the brain is flooded with those specific neurochemicals and the critical mind is bypassed, the subconscious becomes highly susceptible to suggestion. You're basically putting yourself into a hypnotic state to plant a positive intention deep into your own neural pathways. It is self-directed neuroplasticity disguised as ancient ritual.
It's hacking your own brain using drums and sweat. But what is the foundational story that these newly hacked brains are focusing on? Because every belief system needs a genesis story, a reason for why the universe exists at all. And this text provides one, but with a massive, brilliantly self-aware twist.
Yes, the psychology of Genesis. The author presents a custom creation myth, and he's completely upfront, right on the page, about the fact that he made it up.
Which is such a wild departure from the norm. Most religious texts insist their creation myth is the literal historical truth handed down directly by the divine. The author here just says, I made this up, and it was inspired by a quote I saw on a DOS computer screensaver.
A 1990s screensaver.
Yeah.
The quote on that screensaver was, "Our creator is evidenced by our creativity."
To go from a pixelated screensaver to a theological foundational myth is incredible. But let's dive into the myth itself, because despite its modern origin, it is incredibly beautiful and solves a major psychological puzzle.
The myth begins with an entity called the Nameless One. In a time, before space or matter exists, the Nameless One exists in a state of absolute crushing loneliness. It is a misery darker and heavier than the mere absence of light.
That's a heavy image.
It is. The text references the ancient Greek concept of Aklis, the primordial mist of misery and eternal sadness. The nameless one is so completely, utterly alone that it begins to slip into a state of mania.
And to escape that absolute isolation, the nameless one makes a desperate choice. It chooses to violently split apart. It divides itself into light, which represents the male principle, and darkness, the female principle. And in the very moment of that cosmic fracture, they discover what the text calls the first mystery.
We are separated for the sake of union.
I want the listener to really let that sink in. They realize that being separated, longing for each other across the void, and then coming together is infinitely better than being a single, omnipotent, lonely entity. The bliss of the reunion is worth the agony of the separation.
Which creates a mathematical and psychological formula that ripples downward through the rest of creation. Light and darkness unite to create earth and sky. Earth and sky unite to create summer and winter. Summer and winter create the sun and the moon. It is a constant cycle of division and reunion.
And then the myth introduces the three orders of life. Plants are born from the union of summer and winter. Animals are born from the union of earth and sky, but humanity is presented as a unique hybrid. The myth says that sky took the ash tree and formed the first man. Earth took the elm tree and formed the first woman.
Which is a lovely nod to Norse mythology, where the first humans were Ask and Embla, the ash and the elm.
Right, so physically, biologically, we begin as the first order of life, plants. But then earth and sky breathe animal souls into these trees. We become a bridge between the orders.
Which brings us to the pivotal defining moment of this Genesis story. Eating the forbidden fruit. In this myth, it's not an apple, it is the citron. But what the text does here is aggressively, fundamentally redefine what this fruit represents.
This is my favorite part of the philosophy. In the traditional story of Adam and Eve, eating the fruit is original sin. It's the catastrophic fall of man, the reason we are cursed. But in this Wiccan Bible, eating the fruit is not a sin. The fruit represents the gift of empathy.
When the ash and the elm eat the citron, they instantly fall to the ground in blinding pain.
Ouch.
Yeah, but it isn't a punishment from an angry God. It is the sudden, overwhelming neurobiological ability to feel the pain of others. The text uses a great example. A cat playing with a dying mouse isn't sinning because the cat simply lacks the cognitive architecture to comprehend the mouse's suffering. It's just instinct.
Right.
But humans can comprehend it. Eating the fruit birthed the concept of a conscience.
So in this worldview, sin isn't breaking an arbitrary divine rule written on a tablet. Sin is causing suffering when you possess the empathy to know better. It frames humanity's highest calling and our absolute heaviest burden as supreme empathy. We suffer because we know what suffering is.
And this emphasis on empathy ties directly back to the nameless one. The text enforces a strict, unbreakable rule regarding the Creator. It is forbidden to give the Creator a single exclusive name, like Yahweh or Allah, and it is forbidden to refer to the Creator as strictly male or strictly female.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because you might think, what's the harm in giving God a name? It makes them easier to talk to. But the text argues that naming the Creator is the root cause of holy war. Let me try another analogy. I would compare it to trying to file a copyright claim on the universe.
A copyright claim, I like that.
Yeah, the moment you name the Creator, you put a trademark on them. If I say the Creator is a man named X, I am immediately devaluing women. More dangerously, if I claim God is exclusively mine, I turn anyone who calls the Creator Y into a copyright infringer. They become an enemy to my truth.
That is exactly the mechanism Drew is trying to dismantle. Naming the divine inevitably creates an us versus them binary. By insisting that the Creator must remain nameless and that the divine represents the total union of all opposites, the text attempts to mathematically eliminate the justification for religious violence.
It's so smart.
It's a brilliant solution to the theological problem of evil. Evil isn't an external force. It isn't a rival demon god fighting for your soul. Evil is simply a failure of human empathy.
But think about the massive amount of weight that brings down on the individual. If evil is just a failure of my own empathy, then I am entirely, completely responsible for my actions. There is no devil to blame. And that leads us perfectly into the mechanics of how this religion measures consequence. The rule of three and radical accountability.
Right. The core moral guideline of this religion is the Wiccan Rede, which is often summarized by the short phrase, "And you harm none, do as you will. As long as you aren't hurting anyone, you're free to do what you want."
Yeah.
And famously attached to this rede is the rule of three.
Now, pop culture has completely mangled the rule of three. You see it in movies like The Craft or on TV shows.
The 300% return idea.
Exactly. The idea presented is that if you cast a spell for wealth, you get 3 times the wealth back in your bank account. If you cast a curse to hurt someone, you get 3 times the physical pain back. It's treated like a cosmic investment portfolio with a guaranteed return.
The text violently rejects this pop culture interpretation. And once again, it relies on hard science, specifically the laws of thermodynamics, to debunk it.
Let's break down the thermodynamics part, because this is where the cult of science really shows its teeth.
The first law of thermodynamics states that energy cannot be created or destroyed, only transformed. The second law deals with entropy. In any energy transfer, some energy is lost as heat. Therefore, in a closed system, the return is never greater than the investment.
That makes physical sense.
If you put a certain amount of psychological or physical energy out into the world, you do not magically get triple the energy back. That would violate the laws of physics. If it worked that way, witches could build perpetual motion machines.
The author actually makes a really funny joke about it. He says, look, if the 3x return is real, send me a $10 bill in the mail. If the universe magically sends you $30 back, keep doing it and you'll be a millionaire by Tuesday.
It obviously doesn't work that way.
So if it's not a cosmic multiplier, what does the 3 actually mean?
The text explains the 3 as representing the multidimensional totality of human existence interacting across time. You have the mind, the body, and the soul. That is 3. You have the past, the present, and the future. That is 3. They interact in a grid. 3 times 3 equals 9. And in this specific lore, 9 is the number of fate.
Let's explore that grid. How does mind, body, soul interact with time?
He connects this to the ancient Greek concept of the fates: Clotho, Lachesis, and Atropos. Clotho is the spinner. She spins the thread of life, which represents our potential, born from all our past actions. Lachesis is the measurer. She measures the thread, representing the opportunity of our present moment. And Atropos is the cutter. She cuts the thread, representing the conclusion of our future.
So the rule of 3 isn't about getting 3 times the money back. It means that every single action you take is a stone thrown into a pond. The ripples affect your mind, your body, and your soul. And those ripples travel backward to alter your relationship with your past potential, they dictate your present opportunity, and they lock in your future conclusion.
It is a framework for holistic accountability. We talked earlier about the outsiders offering during the circle casting, where people admit their flaws. The text looks at this through the lens of the myth of Pandora's box. When Pandora opened the box, she let out all the evils of the world, the anger, the greed, the jealousy, the plague.
Yeah.
But she managed to slam the lid shut just in time to keep one singular thing trapped inside: hope.
So when Wiccans are actively collecting their outsiders during a ritual, they are acknowledging that they are human. They carry greed. They carry anger. They aren't perfect. But by putting those flaws back into the symbolic box and choosing not to act on them, they're saying, we still have hope. We possess the empathy to recognize our toxicity and the discipline to contain it.
But containing it is entirely up to you. And this creates an incredibly heavy burden of morality, because the text explicitly states that you cannot be Wiccan if you use external excuses to dodge your own agency. You cannot say Satan made me do it.
Right, you don't even believe in a literal Satan.
Exactly. You cannot say the alcohol made me say that. You made the conscious choice to drink the alcohol knowing how it affects your mind.
I want to talk about how this applies to real-world modern dilemmas, because Drew brings up a deeply sensitive issue to illustrate this point. Abortion. Now, I want to be clear to you, the listener, we are looking at this example strictly to understand the mechanics of decentralized moral authority in this text, not to debate the politics of the medical procedure itself.
Exactly. The author uses this specific example because it highlights the fundamental difference in how this religion approaches morality compared to Orthodox faiths. In a religion like Catholicism, the Pope, acting as a central divine authority, has declared that abortion is a sin.
The ruling is already made.
Right. The moral ruling is pre-packaged. You don't have to figure out the math, you just have to follow the rule.
But the author points out that Wicca offers absolutely no central authority. There is no Wiccan Pope. There is no governing body to hand down a ruling.
Therefore, a Wiccan facing an agonizing decision like that cannot defer to a rule book to absolve them of the responsibility. They must search their own soul. They must apply their own supreme empathy to the situation. They must weigh the potential consequences to the mind, body, and soul across the past, present, and future, and make the agonizing decision of what is right or wrong entirely for themselves.
Think about how often we blame our circumstances in daily life. We blame the algorithm for making us angry. We blame our boss for our stress. We blame traffic for our mood. What happens to your psyche if you suddenly strip all those excuses away and adopt the mindset that you are 100% the author of your fate?
It's daunting.
Isn't it terrifying to have no rule book? To have to be your own Supreme Court justice for every single moral decision you make? Honestly, it sounds exhausting. I think there is a huge psychological comfort in having someone just tell you what the rules are.
This raises an important question, though. It is exhausting. But is morality just blind obedience to a list of rules out of fear of punishment? Or is true morality what you do when there is no punisher?
Oh, that's good.
The text argues that true spiritual freedom requires radical responsibility. Without a boogeyman to blame, every action forces you to look directly in the mirror. You cannot hide from yourself.
It's the ultimate "the buck stops here" philosophy. And speaking of humanity's journey toward maturity, the final section of our deep dive takes us on the most massive journey of all. We are pivoting from the internal microscopic landscape of the individual soul to the literal physical history of the human race across the globe, the Great Exodus.
And just as he did with the dying pets, the author transitions into this epic 50,000-year history by starting with a very grounded, modern, infuriating story. The story of Barbara Crandall.
Oh, this story will make your blood boil. Barbara Crandall was a 73-year-old Cherokee grandmother. In 2002, she went to pray at the Newark Earthworks in Ohio.
And for context, this site is considered the Stonehenge of America.
Right. It is a massive, geometrically complex, sacred ancient site built by indigenous peoples thousands of years ago. But when she went to pray, she was arrested. The police cuffed her hands behind her back, dragged this elderly woman to her feet, and left bruises up and down her arms.
And why was she arrested? Because the Ohio Historical Society, the entity supposed to protect the site, had leased this sacred ground to a country club so they could build a golf course over it.
It's unbelievable.
She was arrested for trespassing on the 8th hole while trying to pray on the sacred ground of her ancestors.
Drew uses this stark, brutal image, a bruised indigenous grandmother being hauled off a country club golf course, to highlight the absolute peak of modern society's disconnect from the sacred earth. We have paved over our spiritual roots to play games.
And he uses that glaring disconnect as a launch pad to retell the actual scientific history of humanity's connection to the planet, to remind us of who we actually are.
How does he start?
He begins this re-education by tracing human lineage back through genetics, specifically mitochondrial DNA. He takes us back to a concept known as mitochondrial Eve.
Let's explain the science here. What is mitochondrial DNA, and why is it the key to tracing human history?
Most of your DNA, your nuclear DNA, is a scrambled mix of your mother and your father. But mitochondrial DNA is located outside the nucleus, in the mitochondria of the cell, and it is passed down almost exclusively from the mother.
Okay.
And it passes down completely intact without recombining with the father's DNA. Because it only changes through very slow, predictable mutation rates, geneticists can use it as a molecular clock to trace maternal lineage backward in time.
And where does that clock lead?
That clock points back to a single woman, or a small population of women who lived in Africa roughly 7,000 generations ago. Every single human being alive on the planet today shares her mitochondrial DNA.
We all share the same mother. And based on this hard genetic science, the text makes a powerful, unequivocal claim. There is no such thing as race.
Biologically speaking, it is an absolute truth. The genetic diversity between any two humans on the planet, regardless of where they are from, is incredibly small compared to other species. The physical differences we perceive as race, primarily skin color, eye shape, hair texture, are simply the surface-level results of thousands of years of sexual selection and adaptation based on local environmental factors.
Specifically, he focuses on vitamin D deficiency and rickets as the primary driver of skin color. The text explains that in the intense UV climate of Africa, dark skin, which is rich in melanin, is a biological necessity.
Right. It acts as a natural sunscreen to prevent skin cancer and to protect folate levels in the blood, which are crucial for healthy reproduction.
But as populations of humans slowly migrated out of Africa and moved into colder, darker northern climates where UV radiation was scarce, that protective melanin became a liability. Dark skin blocked too much of the weak northern sunlight, which prevented the body from synthesizing vitamin D.
And without vitamin D, you cannot absorb calcium, which leads to rickets, a horrific bone-deforming disease that can severely impact a woman's ability to survive childbirth.
Precisely. So over thousands of years, people with genetic mutations for lighter skin absorbed more sunlight, synthesized more vitamin D, avoided rickets, and were therefore more likely to survive and reproduce in those northern climates. The entire social construct of race, which has driven so much human conflict, is fundamentally just a biological history of human bodies adapting to different angles of sunlight.
It really makes the bigotry seem so incredibly small and foolish. The text then meticulously tracks the specific, grueling migrations of these early humans out of Africa. It describes the failed first exodus.
What happened there?
Early humans migrated north, hoping to expand, but they were trapped when the climate shifted and the Sahara Desert aggressively expanded, cutting them off. That branch of humanity literally died out in the sand.
Right.
Then, tens of thousands of years later, came the successful crossing. During an ice age, massive amounts of the Earth's water were locked up in glaciers, which significantly lowered global sea levels.
Oh, creating land bridges.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This allowed humans to cross at the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, known as the Gates of Grief, reaching the Arabian Peninsula in modern-day Yemen. From there, humanity clung to the coastlines, spreading slowly across the globe.
And the text details the insane survival bottlenecks we went through, like surviving the eruption of the Toba volcano in Sumatra around 74,000 years ago. This wasn't just a big explosion. It caused a global volcanic winter that lasted for years, blotting out the sun and decimating global plant life. It reduced the global human population to a tiny handful of breeding pairs.
We were on the absolute brink of extinction.
And it tracks the eventual crossing of the ocean into Australia. The text notes a sobering fact, actually. Shortly after humans arrived on the Australian continent, the native megafauna giant, 10-foot-tall kangaroos, massive land tortoises suddenly went extinct. It is a subtle, early nod to the fact that humans have always possessed the capacity to radically, destructively alter our environments.
But perhaps the most fascinating synthesis of hard science and ancient myth in the entire book revolves around the First Great Flood.
Oh, this is where geology meets theology.
Yes, almost every major ancient world religion has a flood myth. It is ubiquitous.
Right. The Sumerians have the Epic of Gilgamesh, with Utnapishtim building a boat. The Hindus have the story of Manu, who is warned by a talking fish to build a ship. The Greeks have the myth of Deucalion surviving the wrath of Zeus. And, of course, the Abrahamic faiths have Noah and the Ark.
The author suggests that these myths aren't just moral allegories invented out of thin air. They are ancient, oral, journalistic accounts of a real event.
Geological evidence points to massive catastrophic flooding in the Fertile Crescent and the Black Sea region around 10,000 to 50,000 years ago, likely caused by the rapid melting of glaciers at the end of the last ice age. The water broke through natural dams and flooded massive inhabited basins in a matter of days.
The survivors of that unimaginable trauma, watching their entire known world swallow itself in water, passed the story of their survival down through oral tradition around the campfire. And as humanity splintered, migrated, and formed new distinct cultures, the core story of the flood remained intact. But the names of the heroes and the names of the gods changed to fit the local language.
It's like a massive global game of telephone spanning 50,000 years. The core truth: a giant flood, a desperate survival on a boat, a resetting of society survives, just dressed up in different regional characters depending on who is telling the story.
And Drew even dives into highly controversial anthropological theories to make this point about human unity. He presents an alternative theory regarding Neanderthals.
Because the standard scientific narrative is that Neanderthals were a separate, distinct evolutionary branch of hominids that eventually died out or were outcompeted by Homo sapiens.
But Drew highlights a theory that suggests Neanderthals might not have been a separate species at all.
Wait, really?
Yeah. Instead, they might have simply been early human migrants who ventured too far north, too quickly, before their skin had time to genetically adapt to the extreme lack of sunlight.
Meaning they suffered from severe, widespread, multi-generational rickets.
Precisely. Their stooped posture, their altered, thickened bone structures, the heavy brow ridges. This theory suggests that might just be the pathology of extreme vitamin D deficiency in modern humans, not the traits of a different species entirely.
Wow. Whether that specific anthropological theory holds up to modern genetic scrutiny or not, it fits perfectly into the author's overarching philosophical thesis.
Which is to relentlessly prove that we are all one family, suffering through the same environment, trying to make sense of it. He wraps up this entire deep dive by attempting a profound, beautiful synthesis. He is trying to tie the microscopic mitochondrial DNA vibrating inside our cells directly to the massive, sweeping spiritual myths we told each other around the fire 50,000 years ago to keep the dark at bay.
He is proving the thesis we established at the very beginning of this conversation. In this Wiccan framework, Science and faith are not enemies fighting for dominance. They are the exact same story, just told in two different languages.
One uses the clinical language of genetics, thermodynamics, and geology.
And the other uses the poetic language of gods, floods, and the nameless one. It was a remarkable, ambitious attempt to make humanity whole again, to heal the painful rift between the rational, skeptical mind and the longing spiritual soul.
We've covered an incredible amount of ground today.
We really have. We started with the intimate, quiet act of taking a hot bath and visualizing that we are stepping out of the primordial ocean. We walked through the psychological architecture of ancient rituals, sweeping away our inner demons and using the drumming of the cone of power to hack our own neurochemistry.
We wrestled with the heavy, terrifying weight of the rule of three and what it means to practice radical, uncompromising accountability.
And finally, we walked across the globe in the literal footsteps of mitochondrial Eve, surviving volcanic winters and glacial floods, realizing that every single person on Earth is part of the exact same fractured family.
It is a worldview that demands you look at the world, both its terrifying horror and its breathtaking beauty, with your eyes wide open. You cannot look away.
And that leaves us with a final and provocative thought for you, the listener, to mull over as you go about your day. If the ancient myths of the past, the stories of great floods, or the nameless ones splitting in two to birth the concept of empathy, were just early humanity's way of explaining the hard science and psychology of their time, well, what are the myths we are actively creating right now?
Think about our modern obsessions, our drive to create artificial intelligence, or our desperate push for space travel to colonize Mars.
Exactly. We are building server farms and rocket ships. When humans look back at us in 10,000 years, what will they think our modern rituals were actually trying to say? Will they see our push into the stars as just another version of the Great Exodus, a desperate attempt to survive our own changing climate? Will they look at the masterpieces of our era and understand the balance we were striving for? Or will they, too, look at our art and our science and wonder who the woman is, hidden right there in the arm of the divine?